Story 1. This happened about 6 years ago. As stated, I was about 12, and my brother was 26 at the time. My brother had been serving in the U.S. Army for several years when this happened, and was deploying to the Middle East on his second deployment, if I remember correctly. Also of note was that he is a Green Beret and had recently, 3 or 4 months prior to this trip, completed the Army Special Forces qualification course, Robin Sage and all that, and by then was an active duty SF engineer sergeant. Definitely not someone you'd want to fuck around with. Given that we both grew up with a passion for the outdoors, he thought it would be nice to take me on a backpacking trip in northern Alabama, the Sipsey Wilderness for those familiar with the area, before he left for 9 months. The trip had gone smoothly up until the third night we were camping out. Around 8 p.m. we had our camp set up, ate dinner, and were sitting by the fire talking about typical boy shit, guns, girls, etc. For some reference, our spot was about 50 yards from a large stream and about 50 yards downhill adjacent to the large path. Our camp, the stream, and the path formed a triangle of sorts. This was summertime in Alabama, so it wasn't quite dark yet when 2 guys who looked to be in their late 20s wandered up and asked if we had seen any hogs while we were hiking around. Given that this is rural Alabama, we actually had seen some farther into the wilderness area and told them so. Even though they were relatively polite, my brother called them good old boys. I got a seriously creepy vibe from them: dirty clothes, greasy hair, scraggly facial hair, etc. I think they probably looked like they belonged in the movie Deliverance. They kind of hung out for a few minutes, maybe a little longer than they should have, looking around, asking us questions like how long we had been out there, how long we were staying, and what looked like them kind of sizing us up. They then abruptly said goodbye and walked away. I didn't necessarily feel threatened by them, and I know for sure my brother didn't. But I still felt uneasy about the whole thing. Fast forward 3 or 4 hours. My brother and I had gone to sleep and were nestled in our tent when I woke to the sound of multiple dogs barking. I've always been a heavy sleeper, and they sounded like they were only about 100 yards away. My heart immediately started pounding, and I kicked my brother through my sleeping bag and asked if he was awake, had heard the dogs. He responded, "I'm awake. They've been getting closer for the past hour or so. Just lay still and don't make any sounds." Needless to say, 12-year-old me was about to shit my pants. We would also hear sporadic shouts from several different sources, but neither came any closer. A few minutes later, my brother whispered, "They're just hunting for hogs. They use the dogs to pin them down and then they shoot them." This gave me some relief, but not much. Somehow I managed to fall back asleep. The fact that they were doing this at night was a huge red flag, my brother later told me, but I think he was just trying to keep me calm. Fast forward to what was probably another 3 hours, around 2 a.m. I had managed to sleep pretty well after first hearing the hog hunters, when I woke up to my brother squeezing my shoulder firmly, saying, "Wake up, put your shoes on quick and follow me. Be as quiet as you can." My heart immediately went back to racing because I heard the dogs and voices in the distance, farther away than before, but still distinct. Not asking any questions, I did what he said, and as soon as we were out of the tent, he told me to get on his back. This was a breeze for him after rucking with God knows how much weight in the Army. We snuck about 50 yards into the woods towards the junction of the path and the stream and crawled into some bushes. It was up a hill, so we had a pretty good elevated view of our campsite. I remember as we were laying there how loudly I was breathing and how quiet he was when I heard the very distinct sound of a pistol slide racking. I looked over, and my brother had his pistol, a HK-USP that he gave to me a few years after this story took place, and was watching the campsite and surrounding area. I started to whisper to him when he put his hand over my mouth and pointed at the campsite. The group of hunters had been steadily approaching our camp, and by this time, 30 or so minutes, had reached it. There were 5 of them and like 3 or 4 dogs. They all looked relatively young, but 2 had either rifles or shotguns, and the dogs were going crazy, obviously having smelled our scent. For those of you who are backpackers, campers, nobody comes up on a random camp in the middle of the night with dogs and guns and has good intentions. I knew this, and my brother knew this. I was scared shitless. I couldn't make out what they were saying, but my brother later told me they were talking about us, although he hadn't heard any specifics either. They lingered for about 20 minutes, shining flashlights around and talking to themselves, when my brother put his mouth to my ear and said, "If they come towards, I want you to turn and run as quickly as you can. Don't stop, don't look back, stay off the trail, and look for the flashing lights." I didn't know what he meant by this, but that'll come later. I knew I could make it back because he had taught me land nav pretty well. He then handed me a flashlight and told me not to take the red filter off. He told me later that the red filter helps preserve night vision and cuts down ambient light so it would be harder for someone to see from a distance. At this point, I was so scared I almost started crying, but at the same time had a rush of adrenaline and what I think now was confidence that he thought I could handle myself. We lay there for a while longer when out of nowhere they started screaming, "Where y'all at?" and firing into the woods at random. My brother dragged me back behind the crest of the hill and threw himself on top of me. Thankfully, our position on top of the hill, we were protected from any gunfire. They shot maybe 5 or 6 more times and then started walking back in the direction they had come. They got maybe 100 yards away when I heard a blaring siren and saw emergency lights flashing through the woods. Turns out my brother had called the Forest Service office on a satellite phone my family has for emergencies while I was asleep, and they had sent out Forest Service officers and game wardens to our area of the wilderness. The Sipsey Wilderness is about 25,000 acres in size, so it took them a while to get there on the dirt roads. When we saw the game warden truck, my brother signaled them with the light and pointed them in the direction the hunters had gone, and the guy sped off, shining his spotlight through the woods. As soon as they were all gone, we went back to our camp, packed up our shit, and waited by the path for the game warden to come back, who then gave us a ride in his truck bed back to the main staging area. On the drive back, my brother told me how brave I had been, and that we would talk about it with our parents the next day if I wanted to. I asked him not to do that because I thought they might never let me go camp again. Creepy rednecks in the woods. Let's not meet again. You might get shot next time. Follow-up. We never got any definitive information on what happened to the rednecks we encountered. I have many friends who have gone out to the Sipsey area and had a great time with no creepy stuff going on. However, it is truly a wilderness area, and law enforcement response, if you can even reach them, would be slow. I was lucky that my brother was there and reacted so quickly, otherwise who knows what could have happened. We also got lucky that whatever their intentions were, they either reconsidered or lost interest. I will note that when they left our camp, the game warden showed up pretty soon afterwards, but I didn't see what the guys and their dogs did. If I remember correctly, they headed in a direction parallel to the stream. Away from the trail cut them off. We waited around 30 minutes for him to come back, and he said there were other officers out looking. There are only so many paths that you could take a truck or quad bike down, so any thorough search effort would also have to be done on foot. Story 2. I was with a group staying about 2-3 days in Lake Havasu, a Native American reservation just adjacent to the Grand Canyon. For those that aren't familiar, this place is pretty funky and strange and a pretty hot tourist destination. A few years ago, a female Japanese tourist was found murdered somewhere on the reservation, and I think it turned out to be a local who had killed her. Anyway, my story isn't quite as horrific as that. You hike about 8 miles from the top of the canyon down switchbacks and onto a dirt trail right down the center of a bone-dry gorge. Some people ride horses into the reservation. There's literally no sign of civilization anywhere until you round a corner, and there's clearly a relatively large town with houses, some minimal electricity, a police station, and even a convenience store. Emaciated horses could be seen in many of the backyards, and you got that uneasy feeling every time the locals looked at you. People seemed pretty aloof though. Just on the other side of the town, further down the gorge, you get to the top of Havasu Falls, which is where the campground starts and the tourists stay. A much more familiar scene for campers than the town in the middle of a gorge with no paved roads. The falls are beautiful, with water-stained blue from natural limestone and minerals in the nearby rock. The blue water runs through all the campsites, and people play in it under the falls. My group settled in for the evening. We were young kids with 2 adult chaperones. We were pretty naive, and thinking back, I imagine the chaperones were probably severely traumatized, being responsible for the well-being of the group. We fixed dinner and sat around eating some backcountry brownies and chatting, enjoying the scenery. Eventually, it got dark, and we started telling ghost stories about scary things like people who want to wash your windows, because it sounds like Dracula or something. I don't know, I was a kid. One of the girls started telling her story. She had the flashlight eerily lighting her face from below. We're all sitting in the dark around her. She hadn't been talking for more than a minute when a boy in the circle turned his light on abruptly and said, "Someone's there." He shined his light on an empty space beside the storyteller, and sure enough, there was a man, probably in his 20s, 30s, white, with long hair, sitting cross-legged. No one heard him show up, and he sat there in silence. The girl recoiled, and the chaperones clearly felt caught off guard. But the older woman looking after us spoke up and asked, "Excuse me, sir, what are you doing here?" The man hesitated a while. "I am just listening to ghost stories," she replied. "Well, this is our campsite, and we were hoping to have some privacy to spend time together. So you want me to leave?" "Yes, please, thank you." The man slowly stands up. He's big, tall, really. He has a headlamp that he doesn't turn on, and he literally walks into the brush and vegetation, which we listen to as he crashes through it. So now everyone is thoroughly freaked out. The chaperones are discussing the next actions for the group, and we decide to stay on high alert and chill there for a minute longer to see if he really would leave us alone. Maybe it was just a misunderstanding. So we're sitting there and we start hearing this thunderous crashing through the brush all around us in the pitch black. A few kids with lights start shining them into the darkness, and periodically this man will be standing motionless on the edge of some bushes before turning around and plunging into the darkness again. He doesn't look angry, but he doesn't look friendly either. At some point he starts making this whooping, shouting noises, and that's when we decide it's time to go. Get help. Our chaperones actually had friends at another campsite where we retreated to for the evening. In the morning we go back to our site. Everything is much less scary in the daylight, and our tormentor is sitting on the bench at the campsite just down the river from us. He's got a camelback on, and he appears mostly to be looking down. Occasionally he looks up at us as we toast bagels in pans and boil water for oatmeal. We're instructed to ignore him as best we can. After all, we have a fun day under the falls to look forward to. As we get our swimming gear set, we stand up, and so does the man. Our female chaperone was the only one left at this point, because someone had gotten bit by something in the rush to the next campsite the previous night. As we walk, our chaperone tells us to walk faster and faster to where we're almost running. As we come up to some other campsites with more people, she decides that this is the moment for confrontation, turns 180 degrees right around, and she faces face with this guy, and she just lays into him, shouting at him about how she's watching kids. What the fuck is he trying to do? What the fuck is wrong with you? Stay the fuck away from us. The man is still staring down, clearly kind of shocked, but now other people are getting involved and he's not being violent with her. She tells us to head up to the waterfalls and wait for her. She was only about 15-20 minutes behind us. The man also showed up about 45 minutes later, frolicking in the water with a big old smile on his face and his camelback. He looked like a kid in a weird way. I almost didn't recognize him. He paid us no attention. When we asked our leader what had happened, she said they took the man, who we now know was named Lee, back to his campsite where his dad was. Apparently they were on some father-son trip, but he knew that something weird had happened to his son at Lake Havasu with his old girlfriend. For some reason, Lee conflated our chaperone with his ex-girlfriend and thought she was doing God only knows what, but clearly something he disapproved of. There was more to the story about the girlfriend running off with Lee's best friend. Mostly it seemed clear to the rest of us that Lee had some mental health issues that needed to be addressed. Story 3. My family and I were camping in the Allegheny Forest in Pennsylvania. My brothers, my then friend, and I decided to go for a trek down a path not too far from the site. We set out at about 4 p.m. in July. Well, we're talking shooting shit as every teenager does when left together. I guess at some point time passed us pretty quickly because it was getting dark. It felt like we blinked and 4 hours passed. We realized we didn't know what direction camp was, and there was no cell service. My youngest brother, 13 at the time, started freaking out. He didn't like the woods and certainly didn't like them in the dark, and that's when the noise started. It started out really quiet, as if it was from a distance, this low rhythmic beating of something. We stopped between some trees, well off the path by now, and waited in silence, trying to piece together that sound. It was getting closer and louder, more frantic, sounding any and all rhythm abandoned with haste. If you've never been in the forest at night, and if you don't have any experience with the forest in general, it's easy for sound to riches off the landscape. It muddles your senses and can easily become disorienting. This war drum from hell was getting faster and louder and sounded like it surrounded us on all sides. Before any of us had the sense to move away from the area, a good couple dozen or more deer frantically burst through our circlet of trees, not just running as deer do, but actively running from something. This wasn't a herd looking for food. This way prey in a desperate attempt at self-preservation. They fled in the direction I was certain was north. We breathed a sigh of relief too soon as a buck came up from behind the herd, breaking the clearing and making an attempt to lunge at my brothers. The older of the two, merely 16, grabs the youngest and dives to the left. The buck parries to the right, spinning frantically and lunging its head in my direction, missing my chest by inches. Its hind legs buck, sending hoofs into the air at my friend's head before bleeding out a frantic series of sounds and running in the direction of the herd it came with. We stood around for a while, listening to them fade away and cracking jokes about how strange the situation was. None of us had ever been that up close to a live wild deer before. We turned and began heading in the direction we best thought was south, back to our camp before the night swallowed us whole. The sound of the herd fading rapidly behind us. The woods had a strange stillness to them on our walk back. The silence was deafening. No crickets, no bats, no bugs in the air. I assumed a storm was coming, and we quickened our pace, dreading the scolding our parents would give once we finally returned to camp. I think the silence is what made the next sound so creepy. It cracked through the air sharply, like the first bolt of lightning before an impending rain, a harsh, high-pitched whistle. 2 tones. A long high note followed by a slow low note. Then silence, a few steps, the whistle again. But we didn't hear any footsteps, not even steps overshadowing ours. We paused and listened. Nothing. We walked and the whistle came, but every time it sounded off, it was in a different location. Behind us, above us, in front of us, to the left, to the right. And only when we were walking, I thought for sure our parents were playing a trick on us. We called out, mocking them for being dumb and thinking we'd get scared. No answer from the forest. Called again, still no answer. Walked forward and was met with the whistle, the same tune every time. I still get goosebumps thinking about it. The forest was getting darker and darker with every step. It was 9 p.m. and we still didn't know where camp was. We thought we found the path and hightailed it in the direction of a clearing we thought seemed familiar, when from the dead center of our group, that hideous whistle sounded. I swear to God, all 4 of us jumped out of our skin and ran. We broke through the clearing and saw the orange glow of campfire a couple yards out. We hauled ass faster than ever before. We were met breathless by my mom, who seemed concerned. We told her what happened, and she thought it was a joke. The adults all seemed to shrug it off, except for my grandpa. He didn't say anything, just had this look about him. He seemed off. Our night continued without interference. 3 a.m., we got into our respective tents and drifted to sleep with the sound of the dying fire not far away. Sometime before sunup, I awoke to the sound of tapping on the edge of my tent. I peeked out to find my brothers visibly shaken. "Dude, did you fucking hear that?" I went to respond when the whistle cut through the night. It was at a distance, but it was there. I grabbed Jake and my brothers. We grabbed our lights and looked around. The whistling sound seemed closer, but we couldn't find anyone. The adults were drunk and passed out. We doused the fire embers and holed up in my tent. I don't remember falling asleep. In fact, I didn't wake up until almost 11 a.m. When I did, the adults were arguing about who trashed the camp. Apparently, when they woke up, the beer cooler was dumped out and the cans crushed. The food cooler was okay, but dragged beside the fire ring. My brother's tent was collapsed but not torn. Charred wood was strewn about. Small things just left as a mess. They concluded a bear must have wandered in and gotten curious, played with the tent and coolers, then left on his merry way. I'm not so sure. The rest of the camping trip went off fine. But every once in a while we heard the whistle from a distance. I don't know if someone was fucking with us. None of the adults will fess up. I just know it scared the hell out of me, and every time we camp in that forest, I sleep in my vehicle and not a tent. Story 4. This incident happened to an acquaintance of mine. He was hiking in the desert in Utah. He parked a long way down a dirt road and hiked toward a 1,500-foot elevation gain trail in an extremely remote area with his 3- and 5-year-old kids. Eventually, they decided it was too steep and rugged and turned around. Heading back down the trail, he could now see his truck far off in the distance and noticed a figure near it. As he got closer, he could make out that the person was messing with his truck, looking in windows, laying down and looking at the undercarriage, and then climbing into the bed of the truck and laying in it and not reappearing. This acquaintance was very frightened and assumed the person was attempting an ambush. So as he got to about half a mile from his truck, he shouted, "Get away from my truck! Get out of here!" The guy peeked out of the bed and stayed put, so he pulled out his gun and fired a warning shot, and the guy hopped out of the bed, made a sweeping motion with his arms toward each of the tires, and began walking away from the vehicle. It was a bit of a game to travel in a way that the guy couldn't catch them, but they eventually reached the truck and found all 4 tires slashed, and the fuel tank in the bed stabbed open and leaking everywhere. They were in the middle of nowhere with no way out, and could still see the creepy tire-slashing guy walking off in distance when he turned around and started coming back towards them. So my friend pulled out his cell phone and found he had service and called 911. Before the guy could walk all the way back to them around 10, police arrived. The man saw this and began running, and the police gave chase on foot. They then called in a plane to assist with the search, but the man escaped completely into the remote Book Cliffs of Utah. My acquaintance was very scared that he'd run into the man again or someone else would be victimized, and for 2 years went without any information about who it was. Eventually, the unknown tire slasher was arrested and connected to this event because he was committing similar crimes. It turned out he was a transient living in a nearby ghost town called Woodside, Utah. His name is Jason Pogue, and if you search his name and crime, Utah, you can see he is still having run-ins with the law to this day. Story 5. This happened many years ago when I was about 16 years old. I live in New Zealand and my family and I went camping in the summer every year when I was growing up. This one year we went to a beach campground at the end of a peninsula. There's a campground at one end of the beach and a headland at the other end with an old pa site. A pa is a terraced fortified Maori village built on a hill on top of the headland. It's pretty wild and remote there, and most people stay at the camp end of the beach, which is fairly long. One of my favorite things to do was to go for a long walk by myself every afternoon, and this one day I decided to go exploring around the headland and see what was on the other side. It was a fairly easy scramble around the rocks with a couple of tricky bits, and I'd done the first part before, but this particular day I went way further and found myself on this little beach with rocks at either end. Absolutely deserted. It was getting a bit late in the afternoon, and I was aware that the tide had turned and was coming in, so I needed to turn around and start back, or I'd get stuck on the rocks, so I just walked to the end of the little beach and stopped to look out at the ocean. It was super quiet, and all I could hear was the surf and the wind. I got this sudden sensation of someone standing behind me, so I turned around but saw no one. The top of the bluff was way above me, but I could see the PA site, and I suddenly got this really bad feeling like I was trespassing and I shouldn't be there. I looked back out to see, and then I really felt like someone was right behind me. I suddenly had goosebumps all over, and I remember I started turning around and around trying to see if anyone was there. By this time my heart was hammering and I was actually scared, so I noped it out of there back the way I'd come. I got to about halfway along the little beach, and I felt the strangest sensation I've ever felt, like something pushed me. Not hard, but as if there was a pressure between my shoulder blades, like someone was just keeping me moving in the direction they wanted. I was in a cold sweat and shaking by that time, and I actually said out loud, I'm going. Once I'd climbed back up the rocks on the way back, everything went back to normal, and I felt myself calming down again. But it was honestly the weirdest thing that has ever happened to me. The funny thing was, when I got back to our campsite, the ranger was there having a chat with my dad. Dad asked me where I'd walked to, and I told him. The ranger kind of looked at me sideways and said, "You're brave." And I think I said something like, "It's really creepy round the headland on that little beach." And he kind of chuckled and said, "Yes, it certainly is." And we exchanged this knowing look, and I knew he knew exactly what I'd felt. I'm not a super spiritual person, but I ain't ever setting foot on that beach again. Story 6. This was over 25 years ago. I'd bought a new truck bed tent, me and my girlfriend, and drove it to a nearby alpine mountain loop to camp out for the night. It was a holiday weekend, and naturally there were 0 campsites available. We were running out of daylight, wondering if we were going to have to cancel our getaway. We soon noticed a branch of dirt road off the main paved road, and decided to see if we could maybe find a suitable natural place to truck camp. We drove for a mile or two and found an empty site with a fire pit and picnic table and no camp neighbors. We hadn't seen another person or car the whole way in. Perfect. The site sat back about 40 feet from the road, and the driveway looked like it had been freshly graveled with larger, loose pea gravel that would loudly crunch under your feet. Immediately above our campsite began a mountain hillside that was covered in pine trees as far as we could see. It sloped upward with a little bit of a hollow in the middle. We set up my truck bed tent, started a fire, ate a delicious meal, and eventually retired to the tent for the night. I usually have a hard time falling asleep in new places, so I was awake, just listening. I could hear a distant low din, like a constant wind racing over an unseen mountain crest many miles away. Kind of a hollow whooshing sound, just mountain sounds filtering down to us, down that hollow. I fell asleep eventually. At about 2 a.m, we're awakened by a vehicle coming pretty fast down the dirt road. As it passes our spot, they start beeping their horn and yee-hawing out the window. Males, as they pass us. They could definitely see the front of my truck peeking out. They kept driving and the engine sound faded into the distance. Very nerve-wracking. No other campers nearby, no weapons to defend ourselves. In sleeping bags. In our underwear. We sat still for a while, listening to hear if they were going to come back. Just stupid youths being pests. It was then that I broke the fart barrier for the first time with this girl. I pushed out a loud fart in my sleeping bag. Thank God she started laughing and the tension was broken. We were able to relax and we both fell asleep again. Footsteps. I could hear footsteps. Multiple footsteps out on the main dirt road coming nearer. It's still pitch black outside. Then crunch, 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 crunch. The footsteps had turned into the pea gravel of our campsite driveway. Gruff, too loud male voice. "Hey, campers, wake up," knocks on our truck hood like a door. 21-year-old me, terrified, long pause. "What do you need?" Voice outside. "We need some help. We drove off the road and got stuck. Can you help pull us out?" Me utterly unprepared in life for this situation. Yeah, I guess. I'll come out in just a minute." I got dressed, terrified about what was happening. What could be happening? I told my girlfriend to stay quiet and stay in the truck tent. I climbed out of the truck tent with a pathetic little flashlight, walked to the front of the truck, and saw two men standing there. At least they had waited in front. That maybe was telling me they were trying to respect our space a little bit. The closest one was holding a rifle pointed at the ground with a bottle of whiskey in the other hand. The other was 6 feet back, at least trying not to look too threatening. I don't know if he was holding anything. The gun guy made nice and asked if I could drive them down the road a mile to where they drove off and tried to pull their truck out. I could tell he was pretty drunk. Talking too loud for the night. The other guy was quiet. Trying to sound tough and annoyed, I said, I guess I could try to help them. I walked to the back of my truck, thinking I wasn't sure if the truck tent could stay up to make the drive. I was half panicked, and I was kind of talking out loud to them. My thoughts about the tent and the quiet guy came back to the back to maybe help me with the tent, which would also reveal my GF to these guys. I'd left the zippered door flap open when I'd gotten out of the tent. I quickly say, I think it will be okay if it stays up for the drive, trying to keep her out of this. Well, he noticed her and said something like, oh hey, sorry about this. Very unsettled, she acknowledged him. I don't remember how. My truck was a 4x4 Toyota with no extra cab and no center seat. We figured out the seating situation. The gun guy gave the quiet guy his rifle and would ride in the cab with me, while the quiet guy would sit on the tailgate with my wife in the truck tent, still half naked in her sleeping bag. We drove slowly down the road to their truck. A drunk guy offers me a drink from his bottle. I say no thanks. He tries to make some friendly small talk. I try to back. We arrive and their truck isn't just off the road a little bit. It's 20 feet off a steep embankment. Also, they don't have any rope or a tow strap to pull them out with. I had a 100 FT medium-duty extension cord for work in my truck behind the seat. We looped it around each other's hitches as many times as we could. Luckily, theirs was a Ford Ranger or similar small truck. We somehow managed to get them back up on the road with a bunch of tugging and burning rubber from both trucks. The extension cord was a loss. The drunk guy thanks me and gives me a $5 bill and a handshake, and they're off into the night. Nerves completely frazzled, but relieved the situation didn't take a rapey, murdery turn at our expense. We returned to our campsite and resettled as best we could back in our truck tent in our sleeping bags, staring at the ceiling. There's no more mountain sound, no more din. Now it's so quiet it stands out. No light and no sleep coming anytime soon. Just laying there stuck listening to our own ears until the sun comes up and we can cook our breakfast and laugh about it all. Nope. After maybe 45 minutes of zero forest noise of any kind, we hear from somewhere not too far above our campsite on the hillside. Crack. Another crack. Then a louder crack, crack, thud. Then quiet again. To my brain, it sounded like something tugging at and ripping a thick branch off a tree maybe 50 yards away. You could hear the fibers tearing, loud enough to echo. We were instantly late to GTFO. We dressed as fast as we could. I shone my teensy flashlight a few times up into the hillside forest to see WTF might have ripped off a fucking tree branch, while hurriedly throwing our camping goods through the truck bed tent flap, and we smashed the whole thing down with our cooler. We hopped into the cab like there were demon hands coming out of the ground to get us, and we got the hell out of there. The sun didn't come up until we were almost home. It was the most disturbing night of my life. The end. Thanks for watching. Don't leave before leaving a like to this video. Also hit the subscribe button to support my work. And as always, have a horrific nightmare, my dear.